Hey, what's up, Street Talks? Eric from the Eric from Street Photography Club. So today I want to give you guys 3 simple photography composition tips. So first tip, what is composition and why is composition important? So essentially composition is how you divide a frame, and there's a bajillion ways you could do this. Personally, I like this rule called the golden triangle, where you draw a diagonal from the bottom left corner to the top right corner. Then you draw the reciprocal line, you know that from the 9 degrees, and your eyes are drawn to this spot, which is called the eye. And I think composition is important because a good composition has balance, form, symmetry, but it's also yet dynamic and engaging. And composition is essentially the scaffolding of your image, and a photo without strong scaffolding will fall apart, just like architecture. So these are some practical composition tips. So the first tip is diagonal. So once again, this is the golden rectangle composition. You start off with this little box here. That's your frame. Draw the line from the bottom left corner to the top right corner. Draw the reciprocal line. And this eye, this spot here is called the eye, in which your eyes are drawn to. And you can do it the other way, the top left corner to the bottom right corner. Draw the reciprocal line here, which is like 9 degrees here. And this area here is also the eye, which your eyes are drawn to. And you can see, I obviously am not drawing my lines correctly, but you could kind of create this kind of grid, and your eyes are drawn to this point. Case example, this portrait I made of Cindy. You can see her head is tilted back a little bit. This is a fun little abstract I made with the iPad and Procreate. And you could see it follows this diagonal composition rule. So obviously her eyes, in theory, should be at this intersecting point, but close enough. This is actually another good example of a diagonal composition where you could see I've intentionally tried to make the bottom left corner align with the top right corner and also the top left corner. So you can see all these diagonal lines, and I have also tilted the composition to make it more dynamic. It all goes to Cindy's face. Other examples, tilting the camera. And this is a technique they call the Dutch angle, where you intentionally tilt the frame. And the effect that it gives is that the images become more dynamic, much more edgy. Another picture, you could see the example, the diagonals, when I'm just walking with Cindy. So when you see nice little diagonal lines, try to get the diagonals coming out the corner and the bottom right corners. And this is also another technique you could practice when you're just shooting with yourself. This is a photo that I shot of just my hand here, and you can see the nice diagonal lines here. Or another composition where I shot this nice diagonal line going to this man here. And you could also see this technique applied to people's hands, diagonals there, diagonals here. Another important concept in photography is figure to ground. So it's essentially having separation between the dark and light parts of your frame. And one of the key elements is having separation between the elements. So let's say you're photographing 2 subjects in a frame. Make sure the triangle and the circle aren't overlapped. So this is a good example of good figure to ground or good separation. Bad, so you don't want overlapping figures. Or an example is if you're assuming this is your frame, you're photographing 3 different things, you want them all to be equally equidistant so they're happy. If they're all overlapped, which is a lot of people do in photography, that's a bad thing. Also, another way to think about composition in terms of figure to ground is assuming, once again, this black box is your frame. Having this little white box here has good figure ground or good separation with the background. So generally, this is the area with the most contrast against the black, so your eyes are drawn there. Then look at spot number 2, which has a little bit less contrast because it's a gray box. Then you could see in the examples 3 and 4, I've made the intensity of the gray a little bit darker, and 4 is really dark. So in terms of how your eyes are led, it's 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the concept of figure ground also works well if you inverse it. So a white background, but you have black boxes. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can see the figure to ground essentially means how much contrast is there between the object and the background. So a good example of this photo here is a silhouette of Cindy. Her silhouette is in black and the background is white. Another good composition technique is a low angle perspective composition. So shoot from a low angle, look up, and it makes people look larger than life. And this is also called the Superman technique. And you can see that this effect works well. I'm shooting with a 28mm lens. If you look in the bottom of the frame, you can see this man's hands look way bigger than his face, which is obviously not what happens in real life, but it makes the images look much more surreal. Another example, shot from a low angle with a 24mm lens. Shot very close to this man here with a 28mm lens. So you can see it makes him look more noble. Example here, low angle looking up, low angle looking up here. All right. So another tip in composition is a curve composition. So once again, we have the golden rectangle here. And this is really interesting, is that think outside the frame, you could see that this Fibonacci spiral could spiral outside the frame, or it actually could work inside the frame as well. And practical ways you guys could apply this, obviously just don't always think about this circular composition, but just try to apply it to your photography. So this is an example, I just photographed my leg, pretty sexy leg. See this curve composition here. See this curve and movement in Cindy's hands. Curve here, and this is just something I sketched. Nice little curve composition and the curve. And this is another good tip is when you're shooting curved compositions, look at the edges of the frame, like this line coming to the top left corner and this line coming to the bottom right corner. Layers. This is another good example in street photography, especially if you want a foreground, a middle ground, and background. So in this example, with these three people here, this woman here in the foreground, a little bit further away is the middle ground, and this man's in the background. So in the red, foreground, yellow, middle ground, and the blue, the background. And you can see it abstracted here. Example here, these arms here in the foreground, middle ground, Cindy and my mom putting on their makeup, and then me in the background, selfie. Another example here. Example here, you can see the mannequins in the foreground, the man with the hand in the middle ground, and then mannequins in the background. Also here, this man here in the foreground, these women, this eyes here, face here. The more I look at this photo, the more I like it. See the layers here, foreground, middle ground, background, foreground, middle ground, background, foreground, middle ground, and background. And the reason why you want layers in your photos is that by adding more depth to the photos, there's more visual candy for the viewers to look through. And going back to the examples earlier, so back again to the golden proportion. So they call this like, the golden section, divine proportion, blah, 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 blah. And then essentially, once again, the way to do this, bottom left corner to the top right corner, then you draw the reciprocal line and your eyes are drawn to these spots here. Another way you could visualize it, and even if you visualize a spiral, it would spiral and take your eyes from 1, 2, 3, 4, and then go all around here. Case examples. So generally, I don't think that when you're out shooting in the street, you should always be thinking about getting your subject directly in there. But I think these compositional grids are a good tool to use to analyze your photos after the fact. So for example, this portrait I shot of this man, I essentially drew this red line after the fact to just try to understand what's going on. And it actually just happened to fit it. So often you don't know your composition is going to follow this, golden proportion, but it still just kind of works. Another example from a still from a frame, I really like this movie called Seven Samurai. You could see when you're framing, just tilt your camera a little bit to force the diagonal in the frame. And last but not least, the triangle composition. Watch lots of great films. I recommend Akira Kurosawa, Rashomon, and you can see this scene here in the movie. There's this nice little triangle composition here. I've outlined it red, yellow, and blue, abstracting the background, cutting out the background, and now you can see all three of them here together. Other examples, triangle between her head, her hands, this man here with the handlebars. Even a good example of Cartier-Bresson, how is he able to get all the hands and the elbows connected together. Another scene from Kurosawa. This is actually much more dynamic. You have the man in the foreground, woman in the middle ground with the knife, and the man in the background. And this is as abstract it is. So you see this is actually an example of two frames where, two compositional tips where you have the triangle and the connection between the three objects, but also having depth. And once again, in conclusion, just realize that everything in composition essentially comes back from nature. So thinking about like a nautilus shell. And the thing that's interesting with composition is most of it does actually come from these mathematical principles, which are kind of like Illuminati mathematical equations that, to be frank, I don't 100% understand, but it seems to work quite well. I recommend studying great cinema, studying from the masters of photography, and just essentially studying nature, and just try to keep it simple. And if you want to learn more about composition, I have a New York dynamic street photography composition coming up. So if you just want to check out that, take your street photography to the next level and your composition to the next level, what I'd recommend is just Google Eric Kim experience. Check out the first thing on the Googles, and then check out my New York City dynamic street photography composition workshop. And it'll be a really fun, exciting workshop for you to learn more about composition and how to take your photography to the next level, right? And if you also want to learn more about composition, erickinphotography.com/blog/composition. I'll include a link below, and then you can see all these goodies on how you can make more dynamic compositions. All right, thanks a lot for watching, guys. Peace out.